And if I could be on the screen as well, that would be good. There we go. Today, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Joshua Grayson to speak on the topic of In Search of Lost Roots, how one researcher traced his family across 3.5 generations. Dr. Grayson earned his doctorate at the University of Southern California. He has conducted genealogical research in German, Russian, Polish, Hebrew, Yiddish, French, and Spanish, and is proficient in many historic scripts. He began formal research by exploring his own family history, and this fueled his desire to help others in search for their own lost roots. He founded Lost Roots Family History, a company devoted to helping other Jewish families discover their past, engage with the present, and preserve their heritage for the future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Grayson.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, for your very kind words. I'd like to thank you for coming to my presentation about my quest for knowledge about my family history. I would like to mention, just in passing, it actually was 10 generations that I was able to uncover the knowledge about. I'd like to thank you to Kolot Mayim and to Mrs. Walavak for inviting me to speak with you. I hope that you find my talk interesting and enjoyable, and that it will inspire you in your own genealogy searches. I'd like to share with you some of the methods and techniques I used, some stumbling blocks I faced, how I overcame them, and just a taste of the incredibly fascinating details I've been able to uncover thus far. There's truly an astonishing amount of information out there. With a combination of computer research, language skills, a lot of perseverance, and just the right amount of luck, the depth of material that you can find about your family history can be simply astounding. The material I'm about to share with you, while fascinating in its own right and maybe a little overwhelming, will serve to illustrate some of the incredible things that can be discovered about Jewish family history. As spring turned into hot summer in sunny Southern California, mid-2016 was rapidly turning into one of the most memorable times in my life. With the election running as a backdrop of my life, I was spending my time finishing up my doctoral degree in music history. While waiting for my professors to provide feedback on various segments of my dissertation, I noticed a particularly odd sensation that at first I couldn't make heads or tails of. For the first time in many years, I had plenty of time available and not enough work to fill it up with. Looking for a new hobby, I turned to
Have we lost
genealogy.
Joshua here?
In truth, you should not have lost Joshua. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, now there was just a glitch there, but it seems fine now. Good.
Okay, excellent. Now let me maximize this. Sorry, the bar for the. Okay, here it is. Excellent. Okay, so you should be seeing the photograph of a younger version of me with my grandparents. Excellent. Ever since I was a child, on visits to my grandparents' house, I would always stop to gaze at a family portrait placed at the bottom of their staircase. Taken in 1904, it depicts my grandfather's grandparents and the first 5 of their 10 children, including my great-grandmother at the age of 11. The picture, with my great-grandmother's kindly wisdom beyond her years, my great-great-grandmother's gentle warmth, and my great-great-grandfather's dignified stolidity, not to mention his enormous handlebar mustache, had always captivated me. To my childish imagination, I was sure I could almost feel their presence looking over me and their other descendants. At times like these, I would muse at how my close connection with my grandfather was similar to his connection with the people in this photograph, and so on down the unbroken chain of time. After I could tear myself away from the photograph, my grandfather and I would frequently discuss family history together. He told me how his grandfather, Simon Penzias, had migrated from Lemberg, Austria, today's Lviv, Ukraine, to Munich, Germany in the 1890s, and about his grandfather's father, Israel Penzias, who had owned a furniture store in Lemberg. Listening to these stories, I wondered who came before them even, who Israel's parents and grandparents were, where in the depths of time we originated. Then my grandparents would tell me stories of their own lives, and I would hear about my grandfather heroically rescuing other Jews from Germany through the Aliyah Bet, my grandmother's experiences on the Kindertransport, both of them listening to radio broadcasts of Winston Churchill that inspired a nation, their marriage in London in the middle of the Blitz with bombs falling all around them. About once a year, or perhaps every few years, we would have family parties. To an 8-year-old child in the early 1990s, these events seemed like an entire city with, of course, mountains of food. Our parties usually included all or nearly all of the descendants of my grandfather's grandfather. I often wondered if our parties were this big just from the descendants of Simon Penzias, how big must they be if they would include all of the descendants of Simon's father, Israel? How about the descendants of Israel's brothers and sisters, even of his cousins? Even as a child, I was fascinated by the notion of all the people we must be related to who we never even knew. With all of this in my mind one day in early June of 2016, I began poking around on the internet and stumbled on a website called Gesher Galicia. I quickly discovered that the site features an amazing database. I simply entered the name Penzias into the database and got a listing for all of the birth, marriage, and death records of anybody with the last name in that particular search region. To protect the privacy of living people, only records over 100 years old are included. In this case, the database covers Galicia, Eastern Austria, later Poland, now split between Poland and Ukraine. This is the region where my grandfather's grandfather had come from. It is also possible to search more narrowly by city or town. I quickly discovered records from as early as 1805. Because our family name happens to be unique, I felt fairly sure that these were long forgotten family members. In many cases, particularly for births, the records provide the names of the individual's fathers or both parents. From my initial search, I found several children of someone named Moses Penzias and several of a Baruch Penzias. All of these children were born sometime between 1805 and 1821. In many cases, I found that they grew up to have children of their own. I was quickly able to arrange the people I found into a rudimentary family tree going back long before Simon's father, Israel. In yet another display of the importance and astounding implications of modern technology, these databases allowed me to accomplish in just a few minutes what would otherwise have taken months or years of digging through archives, scanning old record books or microfilms one record at a time. Now, instead of having to read manually, one can simply type a name, hit search, and look through and organize the results. As a side note, it's important to be creative with spelling. Names were not spelled in a standardized way until much later into the 19th century, even into the early 20th century. Although most of these databases use technology to automatically include names that are spelled in similar ways, the technology is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It's important to play around and try as many different alternative spellings as you can think of. Already some of my childhood questions had been answered, yet they tantalizingly raised new ones. From the information I had gathered, I theorized that Baruch and Moses had been brothers, and they had been born around 1780, maybe 1790. Yet could I actually know for sure? Could they have been two separate, unrelated families who coincidentally had a similar name? I also had several other people from the next generation of Penziases who I couldn't figure out exactly how they fit in. Eventually, I realized that I could use other clues to tease out more information from the records. In addition to dates, names, and parents, The records also contained house numbers, an early sort of addressing system. I soon realized that these house numbers could yield very valuable clues. In many cases, individuals' children had birth records, but they themselves did not. For example, I found quite a few people born in the 1840s and 1850s who were the children of a Taube Penzias, but I did not have any record of Taube's birth, so I did not know who her parents were. Up to this point, I had no idea how she fit into the tree I had been building. Yet, by analyzing the house numbers, I discovered that she was living in the same house where several of Moses' children were living. From this, I deduced that Taube was probably Moses' daughter. I also found out that immediately after the death of Baruch's widow Chava in 1838, two of their children moved into Moses' house, confirming my suspicions that Baruch and Moses had been brothers, or at least close relatives. At the bottom of each Gesher Galitzia record was a tantalizing small note. An image of this record can also be viewed on Family Search LDS microfilm number blah, 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 item number blah, 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 with different blah, blah, blahs on each record. Thus, my next stop was my local family history center on the west side of Los Angeles. As part of a project to preserve the family heritage of the world's peoples in hundreds of countries, the Mormons have preserved hundreds of millions of genealogical records spanning centuries. While I felt a twinge of ambivalence over the issue of posthumous conversion, curiosity got the better of me. Research on the internet led me to an article explaining that although originally the purpose of creating this family history center was to convert people who had previously died into their religion, this article explained that the practice is no longer supported on an institutional basis, and that it is today exceptionally rare and highly discouraged. At the center, I encountered a Jewish genealogical organization with helpful, friendly staff. Knowing the record numbers I was looking for, it eventually became a relatively straightforward task to locate them, once I had familiarized myself with the digitized microfilming system. I soon found the marriage record for Israel Penzias and Chaya Feiertag, my great-great-great-grandparents. I was ecstatic to discover that these original records actually had more information than the Gesher Galitzia database. It turns out that using the database, you get something that describes the records, but not the records themselves. It's more of an index. When I looked at the record itself, I found that it had Chaya's parents' names on it, and Chaya's exact birth date, July 4th, 1842. It also said that Israel was 23 years old at the time the marriage was registered on January 1st, 1865. Armed with this information, I was now able to find Chaya's birth record. Below her father's name was a weird squiggle that looked like some kind of writing. I had no idea what it meant. Another tantalizing clue. I found similar weird writing on other records, but I had no idea what this meant. For several weeks, I wondered what information might be hidden there. I vaguely remembered that German handwriting in the 19th and early 20th centuries had been very different than modern handwriting. I guessed that the squiggles I had seen were examples of this old German handwriting. After searching the internet, I found a website teaching people how to read it. The tutorial included alphabet charts in the old and new handwriting. After some practice tutorials and an inordinate amount of patience, trial, and error, more error than trial, I was eventually able to make out the weird squiggle beneath Chaya's father. It said Eierhändler, which means egg merchant. So it turned out that my great-great-great-great-grandfather had sold eggs for a living. I worked through other records, and although most of them did not list professions, I found that one of my relatives during the mid-19th century changed professions at least twice, from a school teacher in 1838 to an upholsterer in 1840, to a horse merchant in 1849. Each new discovery seemed to lead to more interesting tidbits. By now, I was hooked. Here's an example of the Penzias name I found, and this is in fact the earliest example of the Penzias name I found. An unnamed child of Moses Penzias who was born in 1805. Sadly, the child was unnamed because he died a few days later before he was given a name in the Jewish community, which occurs 8 days after a baby was born. It was sad, but this was one of the tragic facts of life before the era of modern medicine. Next, I turned to my university library and some other historical research tools to see what more I could uncover. Searching through historical newspaper databases, I was truly astonished by some of the things I found. Among the juicier bits was the fact that one of my relatives had been a Cubist painter whose art was displayed at the Salon d'Automne, the preeminent exhibition hall in Paris for avant-garde art in 1912. I was actually able to locate several early drawings he did before he got into Cubism. He did these drawings of Jewish figures in his native city of Lemberg. I found these drawings in a book that's exceedingly difficult to find. It's an out-of-print book about Jewish authors from this, Jewish painters, excuse me, from the particular region of Galicia where my family came from. I also found cover art that he drew for a novel written by his friend Witold Bunkiewicz. My grandfather had told me that his grandfather had served in World War I in the German Home Guard. During the course of my research, I discovered that at least 4 more of my relatives fought in that conflict. 3 of them were taken prisoner by the Russians, 2 were decorated for valor, and all survived the war. I found that many of my family stayed in hotels in Vienna and Bad Ischl, a spa and resort town, in the late 19th century. I even found an 1865 newspaper article from Vienna announcing the opening of one of our family businesses, which actually was a brewery and distillery. One of my relatives was an inventor who took out several important patents, who was actually the same person who was declared a prisoner of war by the Russians and who survived. And I had several doctors in the family. One of these doctors was a woman, Wanda Penzias, who practiced in turn-of-the-century Vienna at a time when it was extraordinarily rare for women to be engaged in the professions. One of the more interesting finds was an advertisement my great-great-great-grandfather Israel Penzias placed in the local newspaper for his furniture store, the same furniture store that my grandfather had told me about when I was a child. The ad even gave the street address for his store, listed at the bottom. It says the street address, it says it's on Academica Street, and it also says that it's directly across from the Hotel George, which I was able to verify that Hotel George still stands, and directly across the street from it is a building from the turn of the century. So the building where my great-great-great-grandfather's furniture store was placed still exists. One of the best discoveries I made came from a website called Genealogy Indexer by Logan Kleinwax. Unlike Gesher Galicia, which catalogs vital records, Genealogy Indexer offers items like address books and telephone directories, all of which had been digitized and are fully searchable. Among the many relevant documents, I found my grandfather's third grade school yearbook. Unlike today's yearbooks, 19th century yearbooks showed off the knowledge that was learned in each class. My great-great-grandfather studied ancient Greek, and his final exam would have put some of mine to shame. Growing up in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, My grandfather was incredibly close to his grandfather. Tragically, although my grandfather was able to help many others, he was unable to procure a visa for his beloved grandfather, who ended up perishing in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. When I showed my grandfather his grandfather's yearbook, we were both overcome by emotion. It was definitely a moment to remember. I used the same website to peruse other historical documents as well. I was able to locate many of my relatives' addresses, occupations, and even in some cases, their phone numbers. Apparently, one of my relatives, Heinrich Penzius's phone numbers in 1886 was 163. From this same website, I stumbled on yet another extremely useful find. Many of the birth, marriage, and death records I had found on Gesher Galicia had what are called house numbers. As I previously mentioned, using these house numbers was able to provide intriguing clues, like, for example, two of Baruch's children moving into Moses's house after their parents' deaths. But just where were these house numbers? They did not correspond to any numbers I could find on either modern or even period maps. I had a bunch of numbers that didn't seem to correspond to anything on any map of the city that I could find. Thankfully, I was able to invent a method to locate them through a publication I found on this genealogy indexer website. In 1871, the city of Lemberg replaced these old house numbers with a modern addressing system. Street names were changed, and each house was assigned a new address number. Although the city has been in 5 different countries in the last 100 years, and the vast majority of streets have changed names multiple times, I was able to use this method, combined with another website I found listing historic street names for the city of Lemberg, to come up with more or less the exact location of many of the houses where my family was living. I am currently in the process of creating a series of maps showing their location at various times. Watch as they spread out through the city right in front of your eyes. I've labeled the children of Baruch in blue and the children of Moses in red. Now here's something else. This is really amazing. Did you notice how on the top right of that map, this one house on the top right on the northeastern area of where I was showing, this one house stayed constant while everything else changed? I was able to use Google Street Maps to identify this house, which was at the time when I originally wrote this presentation. According to my research, this house had been in my family for over 70 years, from before 1800 until after 1870, beginning with Moses Penzius. Now, the reason I say at the time when I wrote this presentation is because more recently than that, with the context of the war raging in Ukraine, I was very worried that archival records in Ukraine would be either destroyed or rendered inaccessible. So I hired a researcher in Lviv to photograph documents, whatever documents he could find in that city that were relevant to my family, and send them to me. And it turns out that this house was not only in my family's history from 1800 till 1870, it turns out this house was in my family from 1732 to after 1870. There's a document which it turns out that the mother of Moses Penzius inherited this house from her grandfather in 1797. And this document that the researcher sent to me, it says who her grandfather was and even who his father was. So through that one document in an archive in Lviv, I was able to trace my family. I was able to push the family back. I had previously gone back to about 1730, but thanks to this one document, I was able to go back to approximately 1670. So now, here's the house where my grandfather's grandfather was born. It turns out that his mother actually owned this building, and her parents lived right around the corner. They lived on the old market square, right next to the Progressive Synagogue. Here's a chart I made of this old market square showing where my grandfather's house was, which is number 5. Number 2 is where his grandparents lived. In the center of this market square was the old Progressive Synagogue, which looked like this. This magnificent structure was the view that my grandfather's parents would have had when he was growing up. From this same genealogy indexer website, I was able to find that various branches of my family spread out to several other places. It turns out that my grandfather's migration from Lemberg to Munich was actually one small part of something much larger. At least 2 branches of my family moved to Vienna around 1900. Another branch moved to Budapest around the same time, and one relative showed up in Arad, Romania in the 1930s. Never in my wildest imagination would I have suspected that I had family living in Hungary and Romania. Here's a map I made showing where several of my relatives were living in Vienna at the turn of the century. Isn't that a lot of information I found? I could have easily made my entire presentation about just that, but surprise, there's more. Occasionally, new discoveries come up seemingly out of thin air. One day, I received notification that a new document had been added to the Gesher Galicia database, a document unlike any I had seen before. When Galicia had been transferred from Poland to Austria in the late 18th century, one of the first things that Emperor Joseph did was to establish a census in the year 1787, tallying his new possessions and its inhabitants. Called the Josephine Survey, the document lists heads of household along with various financial information about the city and its properties. With some creative approaches to spelling, I eventually found 2 ancestors on this census, Jakob Penzius and Itzko Penzius, spelled with a B rather than a P. Living right next to each other, they may have been either brothers or father and son. Perhaps one of them was the father of Moses and Baruch, or perhaps Moses and Baruch had actually been cousins rather than brothers. Maybe Moses was Jacob's son and Baruch was Yitzchak's son. When digging through the Mormon archives for the city of Lemberg yet again a few weeks later, I accidentally stumbled on a fascinating series of records from 1796 to 1804, organized by something called Jewish Congregational Family Number. These numbers, which had appeared on some of the earlier records from Gesher Galicia, had always perplexed me. I had simply treated them as an abstraction up to this point. I basically just ignored them. Apparently, it turns out that they were assigned to Jewish families by the Austrian government shortly after Austria took control of Galicia. More importantly, for my purposes, I had already had several family numbers to look up. Although these records have not been indexed or added to any database, meaning that I could not simply type and search for names I wanted, I could use the family numbers I already had to quickly and easily find the people I was looking for without having to manually search through the entire list one at a time looking for the people I wanted. What I found, what I really just stumbled on, was simply astounding. While birth and marriage records from the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s sometimes gave occupations or other interesting information, records from the early decades of the 19th century provided almost nothing beyond names, this congregational family number, and sometimes house numbers. Thus, I knew almost nothing about Moses, Baruch, and some of the other earliest Penzias family members other than their names. The records I had just found gave much, much more. Occupations, wives' names, including maiden names, lists of children, including exact birth dates. They also provided new family numbers for children who got married and had children of their own, previous family numbers for individuals who had not yet been living on their own in 1796, and exact death dates. For example, I looked up Moses Penzias, family number 2436, which is what you're seeing now, and I found that he had been a fabric merchant. His wife Hudis's maiden name was Rotenberg, and his wife had come from a neighboring town to Lemberg called Kamyanka. I also found that he had two daughters I had not previously known about. Zusa, born on March 21st, 1800, and Pearl, born on September 15th, 1803. When I looked up Moses's previous family number, 1588, I found that Moses's mother's name was Leah. His stepfather's name was Labe, and his maternal grandfather's name was Raphael. I also found that Moses had a sister named Rizel. Although Baruch was not listed in 1796 with Moses and Rizel, this does not preclude the possibility of there having been brothers. Indeed, it simply means that Baruch and Chava were already married and living on their own by then, while Moses and Rizel were still living with their parents. In a related set of records, I found Moses and Huz's marriage record from 1797. Again, all of this writing looks like a horrible mess if you don't know how to read this old German handwriting, which I briefly alluded to before. But after having trained myself to read that, I'm able to understand all of the secrets that are buried in these kinds of old records. Here is Baruch's page from the same record set. It turns out that Baruch Penzias was a coppersmith. He owned his own home, and his wife's maiden name was Kessler. Like Moses, he also had several children prior to the records that had been in Gesher Galicia. Through this set of records, I found that Moses was born in 1769 and Baruch in 1774. They were almost 20 years older than I had assumed. I even found Isaac Penzias by accident, presumably the Itzko Penzias from the 1787 census. He was a tavern keeper and died on April 5th, 1797. Looking through these records for people in other branches of the family, I found a baker, 2 furriers, more tavern keepers, and quite a few homeowners. So there's a lot more information that I could give about my grandfather's mother's family in Lemberg, but time is running a little bit short, so why don't we skip a little bit from Lemberg, from this German stuff from Austria. Let's skip a little bit forward and let's move countries and now go from Austria to Russia. My grandfather never knew his father's parents. Both had passed away before he had been born. His father had not had a close relationship with them, so our family history on that side had always been a mystery. All we knew was that my grandfather's grandfather, Wolf Ruben Grajewski, married a woman named Frida Czak, or Krzyzak, came from Warsaw, was a tobacco merchant, and lived in 8 different cities in Germany before settling down in Stuttgart. Due to the name, which means from Grajewo, We had always assumed that his ancestors had come from that town and had migrated from Warsaw at some point. Using JewishGen, here's a picture of my grandfather's paternal grandfather, taken sometime around 1900. Using JewishGen, another Jewish genealogical database, I found a marriage record for a Hirsch Ruben Grajewski and Frida Krzyzak. The names seemed similar enough that I thought it could potentially be a match. Unfortunately, the website provided no additional information, although it did provide a link to view the actual image of the record. Because most of Poland had been controlled by Russia during the 19th century, the record was written in Russian rather than in Polish. Thankfully, I'm just as proficient in Russian as I am in German, since I studied in Moscow for a semester in college, before that country completely lost its mind. Unfortunately, Russian cursive handwriting is just awful. Even worse, Russian handwriting changed in 1917, similarly to how German handwriting changed in 1940. Prior to 1917, there were several additional letters, and several letters had multiple handwritten forms. Honestly, it's just a mess. I've shown some of the documents that I uncovered in my family history research to Russian foreign exchange students on my university campus, but they couldn't make heads or tails of them. Apparently, I was on my own. With quite a bit of effort, eventually I was able to teach myself how to read it, just as I had taught myself the old German handwriting. All of that effort paid off. The record states that this Hirsch in the marriage record worked selling tobacco, so I knew that these were definitely the same people. Apparently, when he moved to Germany, he changed his name from Hirsch to Wolf. The name Hirsch means deer, and the name Wolf means wolf. The fact that he changed himself from a deer into a wolf perhaps tells something about what his personality might have been like. Although the database gave no additional information, the marriage record itself had absolutely everything. Both of Hirsch's parents' names, both of Frida's parents' names, Frida's mother's maiden name, the ages of bride, groom, and parents, even the street addresses in Warsaw where they were living. Being able to read Russian, particularly Old Russian cursive, was the key that unlocked my grandfather's father's entire family. Using JewishGen database, I was able to find Hirsch's parents' marriage record in 1865 in Radziejów, a shtetl approximately 100 kilometers west of Warsaw. Each new record I found led me to new, sometimes surprising information. For example, I found that Frida's father, Josek Krzyzak, my great-great-great-grandfather, had been a soldier, possibly in the Crimean War. His death record told the name of both of his parents, Mojek Krzyzak and Scheindl Brandt. His wife's name was Chaya, matching what I already knew from Frida's marriage record, and he was survived by 3 children. So my grandfather's grandmother had 2 brothers or sisters. Although they were not named in this document, I was eventually able to find out who they were using other methods. It turns out that I was able to find that this Krzyzak family had been living in Warsaw prior to 1800, while the Brandt family migrated there from a town called Warka, approximately 30 kilometers south along the Vistula River in the 1830s. Frida's mother's family came from a shtetl a short distance north of Lublin. Her father Berek and grandfather Leib had been glaziers there. I found Berek Krzyzak's Polish language birth record from 1812, which is what you're seeing on the screen now, which provided information on his father and grandfather, named Hirsch. On the bottom right corner of what you're seeing on your screen, it has the handwritten signature of my great, 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 great grandfather, written in Yiddish. A few clicks of a button on these databases, plus intensive self-training in handwriting in various languages, allowed me to go from knowing almost nothing about my grandfather's father's family to knowing a great deal, going back all the way to 1750. Thanks to modern technology and a lot of persistence, I found myself going back almost 2.5 centuries. And again, as I mentioned, in fact, I was able to go 3.5 centuries, almost 400 years in the past. Thanks to modern technology and a lot of persistence, I found myself able to discover new relatives I had never known, including one who designed lunar landers for NASA. Using Facebook, I was able to connect with several of them, and they connected me with relatives who today are living in Paris and Rome. And in fact, one of these relatives happens to live in Olympia, Washington, who I visited several months ago. Although he was not able to be at a lecture that I gave about the family history in Seattle, I was able to have lunch with him in Olympia. My search for family history has been an absolutely remarkable journey of self-discovery. Going backwards, I was able to identify the names of several of my 7 great-grandfathers, great, 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 all of whom would have been born around the year 1700. Their children, including my grandfather's grandmother's grandfather's grandmother, were born in the early 1730s. And in fact, as I mentioned, I was able to identify one of my ancestors who was born in about 1670. I also ran into dead ends. I never found anything about my grandmother's father, who died before she was born. Although I found a few things about her mother's family, I was not able to discover nearly as much as for my grandfather's family. Yet the original record books continued to be manually worked through and added to databases on a daily basis by incredibly hardworking people. Every day, teams of researchers are going through archives in small towns and large cities across Europe, adding their findings to databases so that they can be found by people just like me and just like you. Archives, particularly the Polish state archives, have been incredibly supportive in agreeing to such projects. Throughout my research, I got many surprises, some intriguing mysteries, and lots of perspectives on who I am and where I came from. I certainly had a lot to share with my grandfather. In fact, sharing his grandfather's yearbook with him, and also a certificate that I discovered in an archive of his other grandfather's fathers won a bronze medal for valor for fighting in the Crimean War. These were some of the highlights of my life. The memory of sharing these items, the memory of these moments that I shared with my grandfather is something I will treasure for the rest of my years. It is an often stated truism, but families really do link us together with something larger than ourselves. It turns out that my own movement from the suburbs of New York to sunny Southern California was just one small part of something much, much larger. Wherever the winds of destiny have carried us, we have always brought something, some elemental core with us. My quest has not only deepened my bond with my grandparents, it has helped strengthen my connection with the Jewish people. Reconstructing whatever small fragments of information our ancestors have left behind, names, dates, occupations, addresses, news stories, is a way of keeping the past alive. It lets us honor these people long after those who once knew them have passed on. The story of my family, an epic story spanning hundreds of years on 3 continents, a story that weaves together egg merchants and bakers, Austrian coppersmiths and Russian soldiers, Enlightenment scholars, European painters, and Jewish heroes is really the story of me and the story of us. Ultimately, understanding who we are, how we got here, and where we fit in with the grand sweep of history can help us with our task, which is everyone's, maintaining our Judaism as a personal, vital force in the world. It truly is a torch we inherited from the past and that we are destined to carry on far into the future. If any of you have any questions after today's discussion, after the question session, please feel free to contact me or check out my website, which I will be sure to include on the handout. I hope today's talk inspired you to go out and learn all you can about your family histories. There's just so much out there. Much of it is accessible to anyone. I'm happy to offer tips and suggestions to help others find out more about their families. One final word that I'd like to mention. If any of you would like to delve further into your family history than your current research and language abilities will allow, I do have a small private genealogy practice. I'm extremely passionate about using my research skills to help bring these kinds of life-changing discoveries to people who might not otherwise be able to benefit from them. Thank you very much.
Sam, if you could stop the screen share.